How did Carole Lombard earn $2 million? She was the highest-paid star in Hollywood, a blonde firecracker who swore like a sailor and loved like a queen. But in the freezing darkness of January 1942, Carole Lombard became America's first high-profile sacrifice of World War II. After raising $2 million for the war effort in a single day, her journey ended in a ball of fire on a jagged mountainside. This is the story of a tomboy who conquered the world, only to leave it behind as a hollow shell. To understand the fire that burned within Carole Lombard, we have to look past the silk gowns and the glowing studio lights of the 1930s. We have to travel back to the dusty streets of Fort Wayne, Indiana, where a girl named Jane Alice Peters was busy proving she could outrun, outjump, and outhit every boy in the neighborhood. Long before she was the queen of screwball comedy, Jane was a self-confessed tomboy with a chip on her shoulder and a fierce competitive streak that would eventually define her entire career. In 1914, Jane's world shifted when her mother moved the family to Los Angeles. It was a city of dreams, but for young Jane, it was just a bigger playground. She didn't spend her afternoons practicing her damsel-in-distress face in the mirror. She was the star first baseman for the neighborhood ball team, defending her position with a grit that made even the toughest kids stand back. It was this raw, unrefined energy that caught the eye of a film director while she was playing baseball in the street. At just 12 years old, Jane Peters made her film debut, playing, appropriately enough, a tomboy. The transition from Jane Peters to Carole Lombard wasn't just a change of clothes. It was a rebranding forced by the cold machinery of the studio system. The addition of the E to her first name was a fluke, a clerical error by a studio that later claimed a numerologist had advised them a 13-letter name would bring better luck. Carole laughed it off with her signature bluntness, telling friends it was a lot of bunk. But as long as they were paying her well, they could spell her name however they damn well pleased. It was early evidence of her pragmatism. She knew the business was a game, and she intended to win it. However, the path to stardom was nearly severed before it truly began. A devastating automobile accident left Carole with a jagged scar across her face, a potential death sentence for a leading lady in an era that demanded physical perfection. While other starlets might have crumbled, Carole showcased the Hoosier resilience that would become her trademark. She underwent grueling treatments and learned how to use lighting and makeup to mask the flaw, turning a potential tragedy into a testament to her endurance. She didn't just survive the silent era, she mastered it, only to face an even greater challenge: the arrival of sound. While the talkies destroyed the careers of many silent icons whose voices didn't match their faces, Carole Lombard thrived. Her voice was as sprightly and sharp as her wit, perfectly suited for the fast-talking, chaotic world of screwball comedy. She wasn't just a pretty face. She was a comedic force of nature who could trade barbs with the best of them. But as her fame grew and her paycheck hit record-breaking heights, Carole was about to enter a marriage that would test her heart and set the stage for the greatest romance and the greatest tragedy of her life. Beneath the laughter and the luxury, a storm was brewing in her personal life, starting with a man 16 years her senior who would change her world forever. In the early 1930s, Carole Lombard's personal life became as much of a headline grabber as her on-screen antics. The public was fascinated when the irreverent, foul-mouthed starlet fell for William Powell, a man 16 years her senior who epitomized suave, silver-screen sophistication. Powell was the thin man archetype, polished, articulate, and seemingly the polar opposite of the girl who grew up playing first base in the dirt. On June 26, 1931, they married in a quiet ceremony at her mother's home, followed by a sun-drenched honeymoon in Hawaii. To the world, they were the ultimate power couple, but behind the scenes, the friction of their differing temperaments began to wear on the relationship. Despite their genuine affection for one another, the marriage couldn't withstand the pressure of their contrasting lifestyles and the sheer intensity of Carole's rising star. By August 1933, she was in Reno, seeking a divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty, a common legal shorthand for irreconcilable differences at the time. Yet, in a town known for its bitter breakups and public feuds, Carole and Powell did something revolutionary for Hollywood. They remained best friends. Their mutual respect was so profound that years later, Carole insisted that Powell be cast as her leading man in the classic My Man Godfrey. Their chemistry was electric, proving that while they couldn't live together as husband and wife, they were a match made in cinematic heaven. This era solidified Carole's reputation not just as a beauty, but as a woman of immense character. She began sharing a house with her personal secretary and confidant, Madeleine Fields, affectionately known as Fieldsy, and became famous for throwing the most unconventional parties in Hollywood. She didn't care for the rigid social hierarchy of the studios. She invited grips and electricians alongside A-list stars. She was living life on her own terms, earning a staggering salary and dating some of the most eligible bachelors in the world, including Gary Cooper and George Raft. She was a woman who had everything: independence, wealth, and fame, but she was still searching for a partnership that could match her own fiery spirit. As 1936 approached, Carole was at the peak of her comedic powers, nominated for an Academy Award and recognized as a formidable force in the industry. She was no longer just the tomboy from Indiana. She was a mogul in her own right, commanding respect and a paycheck that made her the highest-paid actress in the world. But destiny was about to intervene at a costume ball, where she would re-encounter a man she had worked with years prior, a man whose rugged charm and King of Hollywood status would eventually lead her down a path of legendary love and ultimately a devastating end. The spark that ignited between Carole and this leading man was so intense it threatened to burn down their careers, for he was already bound to another woman in a marriage that would take a king's ransom to escape. The reunion between Carole Lombard and Clark Gable was the kind of Hollywood folklore that scriptwriters dream of. They had first worked together in the 1932 film No Man of Her Own, but at the time, they were both otherwise engaged and strangely unimpressed with each other. Gable thought she was a loud-mouthed blonde, and Carole found him a bit too stiff. However, when they crossed paths again 4 years later at the White Mayfair Ball, the chemistry was undeniable. Gable was the undisputed king of Hollywood, the rugged icon of masculinity, and Carole was the only woman with enough brass and wit to keep him on his toes. They began a passionate, secret affair that became the industry's most whispered-about scandal. The problem was that Gable was legally tethered to Maria Rhea Langham, an oil heiress who had no intention of letting her famous husband go without a fight or a massive settlement. Because of the strict morality clauses in studio contracts of the 1930s, a public scandal could have ended both of their careers instantly. They had to navigate their romance in the shadows, ducking into back entrances and spending their weekends away from the prying eyes of the paparazzi. For Carole, a woman who valued honesty above all else, the secrecy was a heavy burden. But her devotion to Gable was absolute. She called him Pappy, and he called her Ma, forming a bond that went far deeper than the glitz of the red carpet. The breakthrough for their relationship came from an unlikely source, the most famous movie ever made. When David O. Selznick was casting for Gone with the Wind, he knew there was only one man who could play Rhett Butler, Clark Gable. But Gable was hesitant, and the financial demands for his divorce were astronomical. In a move of brilliant Hollywood maneuvering, a deal was struck where Gable's salary increase for the film would cover the cost of his divorce from Rhea. Carole's influence was felt in every corner of this deal. She was his strategist, his cheerleader, and the anchor that kept him grounded while the world clamored for a piece of him. Once the divorce was finalized, the couple didn't wait for a grand Hollywood spectacle. On March 29, 1939, while Gable was on a brief break from filming The Burning of Atlanta, they eloped to Kingman, Arizona. They married in a simple Methodist church with only a pastor and a local high school principal as witnesses. It was a testament to their desire for a real life away from the cameras. They bought a 20-acre ranch in Encino, where Carole traded her silk gowns for hunting boots and flannel shirts. She learned to shoot, to fish, and to live the quiet life Gable craved, proving that the Hollywood bombshell was, at her core, still that adventurous girl from Indiana. They were finally the king and queen of Hollywood, living a domestic idyll that seemed untouchable. But as the shadows of war began to stretch across the Atlantic, Carole's fierce patriotism would soon lead her to make a decision that would shatter the king's world and leave an entire nation in mourning. By 1937, Carole Lombard wasn't just a movie star. She was a sovereign power in the industry. She had ascended from a $75 a week starlet to the highest-paid actress in the world, commanding a staggering salary of $460,000. Yet wealth was a tool for her, never a cage. Unlike the porcelain goddesses of the silent era who remained sequestered in their mansions, Carole was a woman of the people. She was famously down-to-earth, possessing a legendary ability to step out of a limousine in a couture gown and immediately start swapping dirty jokes with the grips and lighting technicians. She didn't just work with a film crew, she belonged to them. After every production, she personally selected gifts for every member of the staff, ensuring that the humblest laborer felt the warmth of her gratitude. Her personality was a vibrant paradox that fascinated the greatest minds in cinema. Alfred Hitchcock, who famously had a complicated relationship with his leading ladies, adored her. He was captivated by what he called her bawdy sense of humor, noting with a mix of shock and admiration that she could swear like a stevedore, using language that was usually the exclusive domain of men. She was a force of nature, fearless, uninhibited, and possessing a business acumen that put most studio executives to shame. She managed her own image, charmed the most vitriolic gossip columnists, and dictated the terms of her own career with a sharp Hoosier pragmatism. She understood the art of the sell, but she never lost the thrill of being a girl from Indiana who just liked to shop for a silly hat and hope her husband would find it funny. This authenticity was her greatest weapon. In an industry built on artifice, Carole Lombard was real. She lived well because she could afford it, but she often remarked that she would be just as happy living on $75 a week if it meant she could keep her spirit intact. She was the queen of screwball, but her real-life role was that of a trailblazer who refused to be diminished by her gender or her fame. She was a woman who had finally found her match in Clark Gable, settling into a life of ranching and quiet nights that seemed to offer the stability she had always craved. She was at the absolute zenith of her life, holding the world in the palm of her hand. But beneath the laughter and the security of her new marriage, a sense of duty was beginning to pull at her. As the shadow of global conflict reached American shores, Carole felt a restless urge to use her immense influence for something more than just entertainment. She was about to trade the safety of the studio for the front lines of a national crisis, a move that would prove her character and seal her fate. When the United States was plunged into the darkness of World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the King of Hollywood was expected to lead the charge for civilian support. But Clark Gable, despite his rugged on-screen persona, was a deeply private man who harbored a paralyzing aversion to public speaking. It was his wife, the fearless and uninhibited captain, who stepped into the breach. Carole didn't just volunteer to help, she demanded to be on the front lines of the home front. When the government organized the country's first major war bond rally, Carole brushed aside the concerns of the studios and prepared to return to her roots in the Midwest. She was a woman on a mission, fueled by a fierce, unapologetic patriotism that silenced those who accused her of mere egotism. The journey to Indianapolis was a triumphant homecoming that felt more like a victory lap. Traveling by train, Carole was greeted by massive, adoring crowds at every stop. They didn't see a distant Hollywood glamour queen. They saw a daughter of Indiana who had come home to do her part. She was a tireless engine of energy, signing thousands of autographs until her hand was cramped and her voice was hoarse. The government had set a goal of $500,000 for the rally, a figure many thought was optimistic. Carole shattered it within hours. By the time the rally ended, she had raised over $2 million for the war effort. She was the greatest salesman the Treasury Department had ever seen, proving that her spirit was as valuable as any weapon of war. However, the triumph was shadowed by a growing, desperate exhaustion. Carole was homesick. She missed the ranch, the quiet, and most of all, she missed Gable. She had promised him she would be home for a specific dinner, a simple domestic deadline that she refused to miss. Her mother, Elizabeth Peters, and her secretary, Fieldsey, were weary and wary of the frantic pace. They urged Carole to stick to the original plan of returning by train, a slow and steady journey that would allow them to rest. But Carole was impatient, driven by a premonition, or perhaps just the sheer intensity of her love for Gable. She decided to scrap the train tickets and book a flight on a transcontinental Douglas DST, a decision that would bypass days of travel and get her back into the arms of Pappy by nightfall. As the small group boarded TWA Flight 3 in the desert heat of Las Vegas for the final leg of their journey, a series of mundane, catastrophic errors were already beginning to align. The pilots, focused on the routine nature of the flight, were unaware that they had plotted a course that led directly into the heart of a mountain. In her rush to get home, Carole Lombard was flying toward a destination that no one could have predicted, leaving a trail of shattered dreams in the wake of the most successful day of her life. The navigation error was compounded by the wartime blackout conditions that had plunged the landscape into total darkness. There were no city lights to guide them, no familiar landmarks to signal that they were flying too low and too far south. Ahead of them loomed the massive, silent wall of Potosi Mountain, a jagged peak rising nearly 9,000 feet into the cold night air. The impact was instantaneous and absolute. The plane struck a vertical cliff just below the crest of the mountain, exploding into a fireball that could be seen for miles across the desert floor. In a single violent moment, the highest-paid actress in the world, her mother, her loyal friend Fieldsey, and 15 members of the U.S. Army Air Corps were gone. The wreckage was strewn across the icy, inaccessible slopes, a mangled heap of silver metal that stood as a grim monument to a rush for home that ended in tragedy. The vibrant, laughing woman who had just raised millions for her country was now part of the mountain's silent history. Back in Los Angeles, the clocks continued to tick, and a dinner table was set for a homecoming that would never happen. As the first reports of a missing plane began to filter through the news wires, the king of Hollywood was about to face a reality that no script could have prepared him for. The news hit Hollywood like a physical blow. When Clark Gable was informed that his wife's plane was missing, he refused to believe the worst, clinging to the hope that Carole's legendary luck and resilience would see her through. He immediately chartered a plane to Las Vegas, accompanied by his close friend and Carole's former husband, William Powell. The irony was bitter and heavy. The two men who had loved her most in the world were now united in a desperate, frantic vigil at the base of Potosi Mountain. Gable, usually the picture of stoic masculinity, was visibly crumbling, pacing the floors of the El Cortez Hotel while rescue teams struggled against the snow and the sheer terrain to reach the crash site. When the search parties finally confirmed there were no survivors, Gable's world effectively ended. He demanded to be allowed to climb the mountain himself, driven by a raw, primal need to bring his ma home. His friends had to physically restrain him, pointing out that the climb was treacherous even for experienced mountaineers. When the recovery teams eventually returned with Carole's charred remains and a piece of jewelry Gable had given her, a diamond and ruby clip, the king of Hollywood was broken. The man who had played the indestructible hero in dozens of films was reduced to what friends described as a hollow shell. He returned to their ranch in Encino, but the silence of the house was a constant, agonizing reminder of the firecracker personality that had once filled every room. The industry's grief was galvanized by the Screen Actors Guild, led by Edward Arnold, who reminded the world that Carole had died in the line of duty. She was Hollywood's first high-profile casualty of the war, a martyr to the very cause she had championed so fiercely in Indianapolis. The tragedy was doubled by the fact that she was returning from a mission of pure patriotism. The $2 million she had raised became a haunting figure, the exact price it would later cost to build a Liberty ship named in her honor. The tomboy who had conquered the screen had become a symbol of national sacrifice, her death casting a long, somber shadow over the glitz and glamour of the film capital. Gable would never truly recover from the loss, eventually joining the Army Air Corps himself in a desperate attempt to find the same fate or at least honor her memory in the clouds. But even as the war raged on and the world began to change, a final tribute was being prepared to ensure that Carole Lombard's name would never be forgotten by the men who sailed the very seas she died to protect. The legacy of Carole Lombard did not end on the jagged rocks of Potosi Mountain. It was carried into the very heart of the war effort she died supporting. 2 years after the crash, the actress Irene Dunne stood at a shipyard, swinging a bottle of champagne against the hull of a brand-new vessel, the SS Carole Lombard. It was a Liberty ship, one of the nautical pack mules of the war, designed to carry the supplies that would eventually liberate Europe. In a poetic twist of fate, the cost to build a Liberty ship was approximately $2 million, the exact sum Carole had raised during her final mission in Indianapolis. As the ship slid into the water, it carried her name into the Atlantic, a steel monument to a woman who had given everything for the best damned land there is. For Clark Gable, however, no amount of public tribute could fill the void left in his soul. The king of Hollywood was a man transformed by grief. Just months after her death, at the age of 41 and at the height of his career, Gable enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces. He wasn't looking for a comfortable desk job. He wanted to be in the air, eventually flying combat missions over Europe as a tail gunner. Those close to him believed he was searching for a way to be closer to her, or perhaps seeking a death that would reunite them. He survived the war, but the spark that Carole had ignited in him had been extinguished. He returned to their ranch, but he never changed a thing in her room, keeping it exactly as it was the day she left for Indiana. Even years later, the industry she left behind couldn't help but look back and realize what it had lost. Directors like Alfred Hitchcock and contemporaries like Myrna Loy spoke of her not just as a star, but as a unique archetype, a woman who could be breathtakingly feminine one moment and swear like a sailor the next, commanding a room through sheer force of personality. Gable would eventually marry twice more, but his heart remained on that ranch in Encino, and more specifically, on that mountainside in Nevada. He once wistfully remarked that Hollywood needed ladies on screen again, and his first example was always Carole. She was the standard by which all others were measured, and for Gable, no one ever came close. Her impact on Hollywood was more than just a series of successful films. She paved the way for the modern, independent actress. She proved that a woman could be the highest-paid professional in her field, manage her own PR, and still remain universally beloved by the working-class crews who made the movies possible. She was a pioneer of the screwball era, but her real genius was her authenticity. She never pretended to be anything other than the girl who could hit a home run and laugh at a dirty joke. As the golden age of cinema began to fade into the Technicolor era, the memory of the blonde firecracker remained a bright, unyielding light in the history of film. But as we look at the empty chair at the king's table and the silent ranch in Encino, we have to wonder, what would the Queen of Screwball have become had she never boarded that fateful flight? Carole Lombard died at the age of 33, a woman at the absolute summit of her beauty, her power, and her happiness. She lived a life that was short in years, but immense in impact, transitioning from a childhood tomboy to the highest-paid woman in America through sheer grit and a refusal to play by the rules. Today, she rests in the great mausoleum at Forest Lawn Cemetery, and when Clark Gable finally passed away in 1960, he chose to be buried directly beside her, finally reuniting with his Ma after 18 years of separation. Their story remains the ultimate Hollywood romance, one defined by laughter, deep devotion, and a tragedy that stopped the heart of a nation. The story of Carole Lombard is a reminder that the brightest lights often burn out the fastest, but the warmth they leave behind can last for generations. She wasn't just a star. She was a patriot who believed that her wealth and fame were tools to be used for the greater good. She died as she lived, with courage, with impatience, and with a heart focused entirely on getting back to the person she loved. In a world of carefully constructed images and manufactured glamour, Carole was the real thing. She was the girl from Indiana who conquered the world and never forgot where she came from. If you found the life and legacy of this Hollywood legend as fascinating as we do, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to join our community here at Age of Vintage. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Carole Lombard's decision to fly that night was a tragic mistake, or simply the inevitable end for a woman who lived life at full throttle? Your engagement helps us keep the stories of these incredible icons alive. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next deep dive into the golden age of cinema. Golden age of cinema. Golden age of cinema. Golden age of cinema.